The jungle was alive with heat and tension. Steam rose from the soaked earth, the air thick with the smell of rot, cordite, and sweat. U.S. Marines crouched in muddy foxholes, their eyes scanning the dense tree line ahead. They had heard engines, faint, rattling, mechanical growls coming from deep in the underbrush. At first, they thought it was trucks. Then the sound grew louder. Metal clanked, branches snapped. And then they saw it. A tank, small, squat, painted in jungle camouflage, pushing through the foliage like some metallic animal. The men froze. "Tank! Tank!" someone shouted. Machine guns swiveled toward the sound. The Marines braced themselves for the kind of armored monster they'd heard about in Europe, maybe a Japanese equivalent of a panzer. But what rolled into view wasn't terrifying. It was almost pathetic. The Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tank rattled into the clearing, its thin steel plates glinting dully in the Pacific sun. It looked fragile, almost toy-like. Its tracks were narrow, its gun small, barely the size of a cannon from an old destroyer. Still, a tank was a tank, and the Marines opened fire. 50 caliber machine guns thundered, the heavy rounds slamming into the tank's hull. The Marines expected sparks, ricochets, the satisfying deflection of metal on metal. But what they saw made them burst out laughing. The bullets didn't bounce. They went through. Each .5 caliber slug punched clean holes through the armor, exiting the other side like it was paper. The tank shuddered, slowed, then caught fire. Flames licked through the seams in its armor as the crew scrambled to escape. The Marines kept firing, half in disbelief, half in grim amusement. When the wreck finally stopped moving, they approached cautiously. The Hago was a wreck of twisted steel and smoking rubber, riddled with holes. One Marine poked it with the barrel of his rifle and said, "Hell, I think my Jeep's got thicker armor than this thing." The others laughed, but the laughter had a sharp edge. It wasn't just humor. It was shock. They had faced the supposed might of the Imperial Japanese Army and found it hollow. That first encounter became a legend in the Pacific. Marines told the story in mess tents, on troop ships, and in letters home. The Japanese tanks were death traps, not for the Americans, but for the poor souls inside them. The Type 95 Heigo had entered the war as Japan's standard light tank. It was designed years earlier, back when Japan's wars were fought across the open plains of China and Manchuria, places where mobility and speed mattered more than armor. Against poorly armed Chinese forces, the Hago was a terror. Against the United States Marine Corps, it was a joke. Its thin armor, just 12 millimeters at its thickest point, couldn't stop rifle fire at close range, let alone the devastating .50 caliber rounds from American Brownings. The 37 millimeter main gun, once formidable, could barely scratch the armor of U.S. vehicles. Against a Sherman or even a Stuart, it was hopeless. And yet the Japanese kept using them. Because they had to. Japan's war machine, stretched thin by geography and limited industrial capacity, had no choice. The Hago was light, easy to produce, and reliable, 3 traits the Imperial Army desperately needed. But those same traits became fatal weaknesses when the Allies brought modern firepower to the islands of the Pacific. The Marines quickly learned the tank's soft spots, the sides, the rear, the joints in its turret. A .50 caliber machine gun could shred it from nearly any angle. Some Marines even joked that a well-thrown grenade could disable one if it landed just right. The Hago wasn't just underpowered, it was outdated. Designed in 1935, it belonged to an earlier era of war. But in 1942, as Japan tried to hold its empire across the Pacific, those aging tanks were all they had. When the U.S. invaded Guadalcanal, the Japanese brought several Hagos to the island. They hoped to crush the Marine beachhead in one swift, armored assault. Instead, they drove straight into history's most one-sided tank battle. As the Japanese tanks emerged from the jungle and charged across the open airfield, the Marines opened up with everything they had: anti-tank guns, mortars, rifles, and 50-caliber machine guns. The results were devastating. Tank after tank erupted in fireballs, their thin armor no match for the onslaught. Some were destroyed before they even reached firing range. Others bogged down in the mud and were abandoned. The attack lasted minutes. When it was over, the airfield was littered with burning wrecks. The Marines' laughter wasn't cruelty. It was disbelief. They had seen Japan's reputation for ferocity, for suicidal bravery, for military precision. But this was mechanical suicide. And yet, behind that humiliation lay tragedy. The crews of those Hagos fought and died inside them, trapped in steel coffins. They went to battle knowing their armor couldn't protect them, but following orders and honor to the end. As the Marines examined the wrecks, they were shocked at how primitive the tanks were inside. Thin metal seats, exposed wiring. No radios in most units, just flags or hand signals. The armor was welded so thinly that light shone through bullet holes like tiny suns. It wasn't a tank. It was a relic. But that relic would keep showing up, on Tarawa, on Saipan, on Luzon, each time ending the same way: burning, broken, and full of men who never had a chance. The Type 95 Hago had become a symbol of Japan's industrial limits. Where America could produce Shermans by the thousands, Japan could barely keep up with replacements. They were fighting a modern war with 1930s equipment, and the Marines, with their .50 caliber guns, were tearing it apart. Still, the story wasn't just about firepower. It was about the clash between two worlds, two philosophies of war. One built on honor and tradition, the other built on innovation and overwhelming force. And on those jungle islands, it was the latter that would decide who lived and who died. Before the war spread across the Pacific, before American Marines ever laughed at a burning Hago, the little tank was a source of national pride. In the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army looked east across Asia and saw a future of fast colonial wars fought across long distances and poor roads. The officers in Tokyo didn't dream of dueling heavy armor. They dreamed of spearheads racing across open country, supporting infantry with light, agile firepower. The man who gave shape to that vision was Colonel Tomio Hara, an engineer who believed mobility was everything. Japan's industry could not build giant steel monsters like the Europeans. Its factories lacked the heavy presses and thick armor plate. So Hara proposed something Japan could build: a compact, air-cooled, diesel-powered tank that could climb mountains, cross rice paddies, and still be light enough to fit on a transport ship. The prototype appeared in 1934. The Army loved it. Weighing only 7.4 tons, the new Type 95 light tank, later called the Hago, was half the weight of an American Stuart and a third the weight of a German Panzer IV. It carried a 37mm gun and two machine guns, one in the hull and one in the rear of the turret. 3 men crewed it: commander gunner, loader radio operator, and driver. That was all. To soldiers fighting in Manchuria or China, the tank seemed perfect. It could cruise at nearly 45 kilometers per hour on roads, climb steep grades, and sip fuel instead of guzzling it. Against Chinese infantry with rifles and a few old anti-tank guns, its thin armor was more than enough. The Hago earned its reputation in those early campaigns, rumbling through dusty villages while enemy bullets bounced harmlessly off its sides. In Tokyo's war ministry, the message was clear. The design worked. There was no need for heavy armor when you could win with speed. Japan's industrial planners, always short on steel and machines, loved the simplicity. The tank could be built in ordinary factories, shipped easily, and maintained in the field with minimal tools. By 1939, as war erupted in Europe, the Hago was Japan's main light tank. It served with distinction in the invasion of China and in clashes with the Soviets along the Mongolian border. Yet that last experience hinted at trouble to come. At Khalkhin Gol in 1939, Japanese tanks met Soviet BT-7s armed with 45mm guns. The result was disastrous. The Soviet shells punched through the Hago's armor at every range. Japanese crews fought bravely, but were slaughtered. Reports from the front begged for thicker armor and bigger guns. Tokyo listened and ignored them. Japan's navy was swallowing most of the empire's steel. The army had to make do with what was left. Heavy tanks were declared impractical for island warfare. Light tanks would suffice. The assumption was fatal. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and plunged into total war, it carried an army still armed for the 1930s. The Hago went to Malaya, Burma, and the Philippines, where it again found success. At first, British and Filipino defenders had few anti-tank weapons. The little tanks dashed through jungles and over rivers, stunning enemies who thought armor couldn't operate in the tropics. Japanese propaganda filmed them proudly, their small silhouettes racing through palm trees, banners fluttering from the turrets. But halfway across the Pacific, in American shipyards and factories, a different story was unfolding. The United States had no shortage of steel, fuel, or engineering capacity. Its designers produced tanks that were not just mobile but heavily armed and armored. When those machines finally met the Hago, the contrast was grotesque. When the first clashes with the Marines happened, those flaws became fatal. The Americans were not facing the desperate defenders of China. They were professionals armed with .30 and .50 caliber Brownings, bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and even light tanks of their own. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese attempted a night assault on Henderson Field with 9 Hagos. They advanced bravely, engines roaring through the dark. But the Marines had dug in anti-tank positions and machine gun nests. Flares turned night into day. The Browning guns opened up, their tracers slicing through the humid air. In less than 10 minutes, all 9 Japanese tanks burned. The Marines who survived that battle never forgot the sight. Black silhouettes engulfed in orange fire, the sound of ammunition cooking off inside, and the realization that the enemy's armor could not withstand even basic infantry weapons. From that point on, the Hago became an object of both fear and pity. Marines respected the courage of the men who drove them, but the tanks themselves inspired grim laughter. The stories spread. You can punch holes straight through 'em with a 50. aim for the side, goes in one way and out the other. They're tin cans with guns. To the Japanese, however, the little tank was still a symbol of national ingenuity. Newspapers back home published heroic sketches of Hagos crossing jungles, banners proclaiming victory. Few civilians knew how easily those same tanks were dying on distant islands. In the field, Japanese crews adapted as best they could. They dug their tanks into the ground to create stationary pillboxes. They used them for ambushes, firing from concealment rather than charging across open ground. Some stripped off the turrets and buried the hulls, turning them into hidden bunkers. These tactics bought moments of surprise, but could not change fate. When American armor or aircraft arrived, the Hagos vanished in explosions. Every engagement told the same story. Bravery could not compensate for steel. By 1943, the Marines didn't even bother bringing full tank units to many landings. They trusted their infantry weapons to deal with Japanese armor. And they were right. Meanwhile, the Imperial Army tried desperately to upgrade. Engineers proposed the Type 98 Kenny and the Type 97 Chiha with thicker armor and larger guns, but production never met demand. Japan's industry was collapsing under Allied bombing and raw material shortages. The Hago, outdated but simple, kept rolling off the lines because it could still be built. Each new batch went to a new island, a new doomed garrison: Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Luzon. The same result every time: light tanks charging into American fire, burning within minutes. And yet the story of the Hago is not just one of failure. It is also a story of the limits of empire. Japan had conquered vast territories, but lacked the industrial muscle to defend them. The Hago was the perfect metaphor: brave, determined, but fragile against modernity. When U.S. Marines found those wrecks and laughed at how easily bullets passed through them, they weren't just mocking a tank. They were witnessing the moment when one nation's industrial illusions met another's overwhelming reality. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years. But the lesson was already written in the smoke above Guadalcanal. Technology and production, not just courage, would decide the fate of empires. The Pacific Islands were never quiet for long. Even after the first burning Hagos lay twisted in the mud of Guadalcanal, the jungle kept echoing with gunfire, insects, and the low growl of engines somewhere out of sight. The Marines had learned something important. Japanese armor wasn't invincible, far from it. And once that lesson sank in, the fight changed forever. The Marines began to hunt tanks. They had entered the war expecting the worst. Stories from Europe told of indestructible German panzers, and nobody wanted to meet one head-on. But the Pacific was different. Here, the terrain favored the defender. Thick jungle, soft sand, coral reefs, and hills that could break a tank's suspension in minutes. Instead of columns of armor, Japanese forces relied on small units and ambushes. When the Marines realized that the enemy's tanks were thin-skinned and clumsy, they started turning every piece of heavy weaponry they had into tank killers. The .50 caliber Browning M2 became legendary for a reason. Firing rounds as big as a man's thumb, it could chew through anything the Japanese brought to the battlefield. Marines mounted them on jeeps, dug them into foxholes, or used them on tripods hidden among the palm trees. The gun's heavy thump echoed through every battle, a mechanical heartbeat that the Japanese learned to fear. A single burst could shred the side of a Hago. The bullets tore through armor, ripped through fuel tanks, and often ignited the diesel fuel inside. One Marine recalled watching a tracer round punch through a tank's side, disappear for half a second, and then reappear in a flash of orange flame. But the Marines didn't stop there. They started developing tactics around it. Tank traps, ambush zones, and kill corridors became standard. Engineers planted mines on roads, dug pits covered with palm leaves, or filled gullies with spikes. If a Hago approached a defensive line, Marines would let it roll close enough that every gun could open fire at once. Sometimes they'd even let the first shot bounce off, to draw the tank in further before hitting it with a storm of bullets, grenades, and 37mm anti-tank shells. In other cases, they attacked from above. Jungle terrain offered high ground, ridges, hills, even trees. A well-placed Marine with a bazooka or anti-tank grenade could strike the tank's vulnerable top armor, which was barely thicker than sheet metal. Many tanks died that way, from above, burning as their engines screamed in vain. As the Marines adapted, the Japanese did too. They learned to fear open ground. The Hagos began appearing in ambush positions, half buried in the jungle or behind ridgelines. They fought defensively, waiting for Marines to pass before striking from behind. At night, they moved under cover of darkness, hoping surprise could make up for weakness. Sometimes it worked. On Guadalcanal, one Marine column advancing through dense foliage suddenly found itself attacked by 3 Hagos at close range. The tanks fired point-blank into the column, shells exploding among trees and dirt. Chaos followed. But within minutes, the Marines regrouped, brought up their Brownings, and returned fire. One tank burst into flames immediately. Another's turret was torn off by grenades. The third tried to escape, but its thin tracks broke under the strain. It was left crippled in the mud, a monument to futility. To the Marines, those encounters were proof of superiority, not arrogance, but the confidence born from experience. They began to realize that the Japanese tanks, once symbols of terror in Asia, were nothing more than fragile relics under modern firepower. Still, nobody underestimated the men inside those tanks. Japanese crews fought with a kind of fatalism that Americans found both horrifying and admirable. Many refused to surrender, choosing to die inside their burning machines. When a Hago was disabled, Marines often approached carefully, knowing a wounded crew might still fire from inside or detonate grenades to take enemies with them. In one famous incident on Tarawa, a burning Hago lay at the edge of the beach, smoke curling into the sky. As Marines moved in to inspect it, the tank's hatch burst open. A single Japanese soldier crawled out, his uniform on fire, clutching a pistol. He fired wildly before collapsing. The Marines stood silently, watching the smoke drift toward the ocean. The tank was a tomb. For U.S. military tacticians, the encounters were a treasure trove of data. Engineers studied the wrecks, measuring armor thickness, cataloging damage, and testing how various weapons performed. Their reports concluded that the Hago could be penetrated by nearly every American infantry weapon at short range, rifles at weak points, grenades underneath, and machine guns anywhere. The knowledge shaped future doctrine. The Marines realized that in the Pacific, they didn't need massive tank battles. They needed flexible anti-tank teams. Squads were reorganized to carry more bazookas, flamethrowers, and heavy machine guns. Infantry became the real tank destroyers, moving faster than any armor. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command continued to send Hagos to the front. not because they believed in the tank, but because they had nothing better. The heavier Type 97 Chi-Ha was in short supply, and newer models couldn't be built in time. Each island defense force was given whatever could be spared, which usually meant a handful of Hagos and a prayer. The pattern repeated over and over. At Tarawa, the tiny island's defenders fielded about 14 Hagos. They waited until the American landing craft were ashore, then counterattacked across the open coral flats. The result was a massacre. The tanks bogged down in soft sand. Their guns couldn't depress far enough to hit the beach. Marines shot them to pieces before they reached the waterline. On Saipan, a desperate armored counterattack led by 30 Japanese tanks ended in flames. The night sky turned red as the Marines' machine guns, artillery, and bazookas ripped through the assault. When morning came, all 30 lay destroyed. To the Americans, these battles were terrifying yet predictable. To the Japanese, they were tragic acts of honor, futile charges meant to delay the inevitable. The Hago crews went out knowing they wouldn't return. They fought because that was the code of Bushido, to die fulfilling one's duty. As the campaign advanced, Marines began to view the Hago not as a threat, but as a signal, a sign that the enemy was growing desperate. Every wrecked tank they passed told the same story. Japan's industrial power could no longer keep up, but the Marines' confidence carried its own risks. Overconfidence, complacency. In later battles, especially when new Japanese tank models appeared, American units sometimes underestimated their opponents and paid for it. The Pacific was full of surprises, and the Hago's weakness didn't mean every Japanese tank would be the same. Still, no other machine so clearly symbolized the changing tide of the war. By late 1944, the U.S. had turned tank hunting into an art. Units carried shaped charges, flamethrowers, satchel explosives, and recoil-less rifles. Entire schools were created to train soldiers in how to destroy armor. What began as laughter at a bullet-riddled tank became doctrine, systematic, efficient, and deadly. For the Japanese, there was no escaping the nightmare. The Hago had once represented modern warfare. Now it was a coffin on treads. But the crews kept climbing inside, tightening their helmets, saying their prayers, and driving toward enemy fire. They fought for honor, even when the war machine behind them had failed. The Marines, hardened by countless encounters, learned to see the tanks not as jokes, but as tragic symbols, evidence of courage wasted by a flawed design. Every time a .50 caliber burst shredded another Hago, they weren't just destroying a tank. They were watching the death of an empire's illusion. By late 1944, the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. The United States now owned the sky, the sea, and, bit by bit, the land beneath. Each new island captured became a springboard for the next invasion. For Japan, every loss cut another artery of supply. The empire was bleeding steel, fuel, and men. Yet, on the beaches of the Philippines and the hills of Okinawa, one familiar silhouette still appeared through the smoke: the small, stubborn Type 95 Hago. No one in Tokyo truly believed it could turn the tide. But there were hundreds left in depots across Asia, and every scrap of armor mattered. Engineers added small improvements: extra plates bolted to the front, sandbags piled over the engine deck, concrete poured into the turret. None of it helped. The .50 caliber still punched through. When American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, the Japanese launched one of their last large-scale armored counterattacks in the Pacific. Dozens of Hagos and a few heavier Chihas rolled out of the jungle, their engines wheezing, their crews chanting prayers. The tanks advanced bravely into the firestorm of American artillery. The result was predictable. Within minutes, the column was engulfed in explosions. Some tanks burned before they ever reached firing range. Others were flipped onto their sides by shell blasts. When the smoke cleared, the road was littered with smoking wrecks and lifeless bodies. U.S. soldiers later wrote that the attack looked less like a battle and more like a funeral procession. The same story repeated on Luzon, on Iwo Jima, and finally on Okinawa. By then, the Japanese no longer called them tanks, they called them honor vehicles. Crews knew that climbing inside meant death. Many replaced their main ammunition with high-explosive shells packed with gasoline, planning to ram American positions and detonate themselves. On Okinawa, a Marine patrol watched in horror as one Hago, already burning, accelerated straight toward their foxholes. The driver was clearly aflame, his uniform a torch. He never slowed. The tank exploded in a ball of fire just meters away, killing him instantly but sparing the Marines. It was suicide turned into tactics, a symbol of how far the Imperial Army had fallen. American troops began encountering Hagos used as bunkers rather than vehicles. Buried up to their turrets in the ground, they served as stationary gun posts. Some were disguised under camouflage nets or palm fronds. Others were dug into cave entrances, their guns covering narrow paths that led to hidden fortifications. These static defenses could surprise careless attackers, but once discovered, they were easy prey for flamethrowers and explosives. The Marines learned to clear them methodically. A flamethrower team would approach undercover, unleash a stream of burning fuel into the slit of a turret, and then toss in grenades. The explosion that followed was final. For the men inside, there was no escape. Japanese doctrine taught that surrender was shameful. Many crews carried grenades to end their own lives if their tank was disabled. American after-action reports describe opening hatches only to find 3 burned bodies, pistols still in hand. Yet even in those last hopeless battles, the Hago achieved moments of grim effectiveness. In the dense jungles of northern Luzon, one ambush caught a convoy of U.S. trucks by surprise. A pair of hidden tanks opened fire from close range, destroying several vehicles before aircraft spotted them and obliterated the position. For a few minutes, the old machines had bitten back. Those rare successes only underlined the tragedy. The men who fought in Hagos were not fools. They were soldiers trapped in a machine history had already buried. Many came from farming families, trained hastily, sent to islands they had never heard of, and ordered to die in steel boxes that could barely stop a bullet. American intelligence units studied captured documents and interviews with prisoners to understand the mindset. They found notes from tank commanders who wrote, "We will die gladly for the Emperor. Even if our armor is thin, our hearts are strong." To them, the Hago's weakness wasn't shameful, it was a test of spirit. For the Marines, that mentality was hard to grasp. They saw bravery where there could have been strategy, sacrifice where there should have been reason. After each engagement, engineers still measured armor thickness and impact holes, but the numbers no longer mattered. The war had turned psychological. Every destroyed Hago was a message. The Empire still refused to surrender, no matter how hopeless. By the final months of 1945, the few surviving tanks were scattered across the ruins of the Pacific. Some sat abandoned in caves, others rusted on beaches where the tide lapped against their twisted hulls. When U.S. occupation forces arrived in Japan, they found training fields filled with decaying Heigos, their paint flaking, their engines cannibalized for parts. The little tank that once symbolized Japan's mechanized future now stood as a relic of its collapse. The symbol and the lesson. The Type 95 Heigo never truly disappeared. After the war, American soldiers used captured examples for training and museum displays. Children in Okinawa climbed on their rusted shells. In Southeast Asia, local militias used abandoned Hagos well into the 1950s, proof that even a failed design could linger. Historians today see the tank as a warning written in steel. It shows what happens when strategy ignores reality, when courage is asked to replace industry. The Heigo worked in the small colonial wars of the 1930s because Japan's enemies were unarmed. But a global war demanded armor, radios, logistics, and factories. The empire had none to spare. For the U.S. Marines, the Hago became part of legend. Veterans told stories of the first time they saw .50 caliber bullets pass through one side and out the other. They laughed, yes, but the laughter hid something deeper. Relief that, for once, the battlefield favored them. In jungles where disease, heat, and ambush ruled every day, the fragile Japanese tank was a rare enemy they could defeat easily. One Marine later summed it up. We pitied the men in those things. They were brave, but bravery doesn't stop bullets. Epilogue. Echoes of steel. Decades later, on the islands of the Pacific, the skeletons of Heigos still sit half-buried in vines. Their thin armor is pierced by neat, round holes, each one a frozen moment of impact. Tourists photograph them. Historians measure them. But the steel tells the story better than any book could. How a machine built for conquest became a monument to defeat. When U.S. Marines first found the Hago and laughed as their bullets tore through it, they weren't mocking a toy tank. They were witnessing the collapse of an idea, the belief that willpower alone could match an industrial giant. In that sense, every hole left by a .50 caliber round is not just battle damage, it's history carved into metal.